Big story that we're tracking on the show today on India Global is what's unfolding in the Middle East. It looks like that there's been a fresh round of strikes that have taken place by Israel. 70 is the death toll by some measure. A lot of that is because, of course, Israel's fresh airstrikes across Gaza as it has resumed its bombing in the region. What it says is that since 1st of March, the first phase of the ceasefire ended. There is no clarity on how the talks will proceed from here on. Phase 2 of the ceasefire that was earlier negotiated required Israel to completely exit this region, something that Benjamin Netanyahu's government feels is absolutely a deal breaker simply because it will allow Hamas to regroup as well. What's the future like for this potential tenuous ceasefire that was holding on by a thread? What happens to those 59 hostages? What about the civilians who are, of course, in the midst of these fresh airstrikes that are taking place? Some reports indicate that Israel's ground offensive is actually most significant since November 2023, right after it responded to that October 2023 Hamas attack. The military has also reported regaining control of the center of the Netzarim Corridor, and some reports indicate that airstrikes have claimed the lives of 510 Palestinians since Tuesday. Hamas has condemned the ground ops and the breach of the corridor as a new and dangerous violation of the 2-month-old ceasefire. As I said, it expired on 1st of March, and since then, everything has been up in the air. Whether mediators will be able to find out possible ways to bring the two sides back on the table is really the key question here. All right, and in fact, as we discuss this in greater detail, let's put out those big questions that I want to put forth to the guests joining me on the broadcast. First is, will it be Donald Trump who will now have to broker a ceasefire in this region? Remember, he did put his political capital, which is why those 3 phases were discussed, with 2 and 3 essentially being more theoretical than practical. The second key question in this discussion that I will have is that will there actually be a phase 2? Phase 1 happened, 190 or hostages came back, thousands and hundreds of prisoners were released by Israel in exchange. But what happens going forward? And that's the next question as well, that what will be the release of hostages? How and when will that happen? There are 59 of them. Not all of them are alive, but the fact is Israel wants them back. How will that happen? Their families have also been crying out for help. And lastly, Netanyahu's government has made it very clear that these ground ops will continue. It's not a short-term, but a long-term process if it requires. How long will America back it before it decides it's finally time to talk on this? James Dorsey joining me to talk more on this. He's a Middle East expert, adjunct senior fellow at Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And also with me is Mr. Hoffman, Israeli-American journalist. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time to speak to me on this issue. And in fact, Mr. Hoffman, let me start with you. As things stand right now, one has to point out that these strikes are happening at a time when it is the holy month of Ramadan, and the numbers that are coming in terms of casualties is fairly significant.
And every casualty that there is the fault of Hamas, which could end the war in a moment by releasing the 59 hostages that they're still holding. Hopefully 24 are still alive. The fact that they're holding them and 35 dead people, which is gruesome and disgusting, needs to stop. And just an hour ago, they fired a missile at Tel Aviv. It landed in the city of Rishon LeZion, just to the south. 3 different missiles. One was shut down. 2 of them landed in open areas. There's shrapnel all over the city of Rishon LeZion. I was woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by solidarity fire from Yemen, from the Houthis. So all this needs to stop.
Hostilities have come back in full swing. And in fact, let me ask this to you, Mr. Dorsey, that do you now expect Trump administration to focus on this region once again? Because Donald Trump did put in his political capital, which is why one did see phase 1. But how does one get to phase 2 of this ceasefire?
Well, I think in terms of Donald Trump, the question is not if, but when. I think that the current military operation, a resumption of the military operation in Gaza, serves two purposes as far as Prime Minister Netanyahu is concerned. One is a tactical purpose, which was the return of Itamar Ben-Gvir to the cabinet to ensure a majority in Parliament, particularly in advance of the budget discussions, which, if no budget had been failed, would have led to the fall of the government by legal definition. But the second objective is a much more strategic objective, if you wish, and that is backed by the United States to try and detract or extract from Hamas as many of the hostages as it can, because that would weaken Hamas's negotiating position in whatever negotiation takes place for a second phase and ultimately an end to the war and a post-war administration of Gaza. So in that sense, I think the question is going to be, when does Trump...
Mr. Dorsey, how soon do you see that happening?
That's the $64,000 question. I think right now you have an Egyptian proposal on the table, which is to release up to 6 hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, as well as a revival of the second Gaza ceasefire talks and the return or the opening of the borders for the flow of humanitarian aid. The problem with that is that Hamas wants guarantees that Israel will abide by the agreement and that this will lead to an end to the war. Whatever guarantees are given are basically not worth the paper on which they are written.
Indeed, that in fact is pretty much the crux of the problem. But Mr. Hoffman, I understand the fact that since 1st March, there's been a very credible security threat that because there's a sort of a ceasefire-like situation, it allows Hamas to regroup and probably come back in full swing and hit back Israel, which is why one might explain these fresh strikes taking place. But what's the way out? Because, if Mr. Netanyahu says that he's willing to go for as long as it takes, then are we really looking at any sort of an end solution here?
Yes, there is a goal of removing Hamas from power and ensuring that they won't be able to govern again. Hamas in power harms not only Israelis, but Palestinians in Gaza as well, who deserve to live not under an Islamic jihadist genocidal dictatorship, but under people who will take the aid that will come in from around the world and use it to build above ground for their own people and not to build terror tunnels below ground to kidnap and attack Israel. And that's around the corner, Gaurie. I really see it happening. My hope is that with the ground forces coming in, that they're coming in right now with some kind of intelligence that they gained from the recently released hostages, who perhaps could tell them where their brothers are, and perhaps there won't have to be what are called prisoner exchanges, but our Israeli civilians are being released from, or kidnapped from a dance festival in return for hundreds of convicted murderers and terrorists being released from prison. If that could be avoided again, that would be much better for the people of Israel and for the people of Gaza. In the end, there's going to be some kind of international stewardship over Gaza. The United Arab Emirates is going to be involved. Saudi Arabia will be involved in one way or another. But Hamas.
So in that sense, we are pretty much back to what we started, Mr. Hoffman. Do you think that? Because, even Hamas is saying that mediators need to come back on the negotiating table. So are we going back to what started, in January this year, when the whole negotiation process did lead to some sort of a conclusion?
I would love to go back to where we were on October 6, 2023, when the headlines around the world were talking about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia moving forward toward normalization with Israel that would have doubled, or even by the end of the negotiations, tripled the amount of Gazan workers coming into Israel.
Indeed, yeah. Mr. Dorsey, you want to come in there in terms of the role that mediators will now have to play and how soon they will have to start this?
Well, basically what you have is a situation in which there is a fundamental divergence in the objectives of a ceasefire. And that's what the mediators until now have not been able to bridge, which is Israel wants the war to continue for a variety of reasons, including the goal of destroying Hamas the experience up until now with Gaza and with Hezbollah in Lebanon is that you don't destroy these groups in this form and fashion. You may very much decimate their military capabilities, weaken them, but you don't destroy them. Whereas what Hamas wants is an end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal, complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Those are the contradictory objectives that were not addressed for all practical matters in the ceasefire agreement, and that's why you're having this revival of hostilities.
Indeed, and which brings me to ask you my final question, Mr. Dorsey, that how soon do you see the Trump administration probably putting all its political capital behind the crisis in the Middle East? They've done so for Russia, Ukraine. One can have a different debate about how much of progress it's made, but they've put their political capital there. Do you see now they're putting that completely behind this crisis?
I'd love to tell you that that's going to happen as we speak. Fact of the matter is, I don't think anybody knows. I don't see how this can continue for very long, particularly given that the United States needs Arab backing in dealing with Iran. Trump wants to be seen as a peacemaker, so I would assume that this is not going to go on for very long, including, keep in mind, that the Israeli blockade in terms of the flow of humanitarian aid and the cutting off of electricity to the Strip has been now going on for more than 2 weeks. It's not a sustainable situation.
Mr. Hoffman, final word, you want to come in there in terms of this is not sustainable. Sooner rather than later, you'll have America stepping in.
What's not sustainable is that you're going to have continued threats from Hamas to do October 7th over and over and over again. They didn't accept any of the ceasefire proposals, and that's why the current operation was necessary. I don't think this is going to be a very long operation either. I think that with American backing this time, which is stronger than there was during the previous administration in Washington, Israel will be able to accomplish its goals quicker for the betterment of the people of Israel and the Palestinian people, and lead toward renewed talks with Saudi Arabia on making the entire world safer.
All right, we leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks much for speaking to me on India Global. Hopefully, we'll be able to find some sort of a negotiated settlement towards peace on this issue.